Welcome to the Regeneration Collective podcast, the next UN Visions for a Regenerative Future. I'm Silke von Brockhausen, a UN insider with 18 years across more than a dozen UN missions and founder of the Regeneration Collective. As the UN approaches its 80th year and the campaign for the next Secretary General gets underway amid protracted conflicts, widening inequalities, and crossed planetary boundaries, we ask, how can the UN become the platform through which people, institutions, and the more than human world repair and transform broken systems and create conditions where life can thrive? In each episode, we speak with regenerative practitioners, policy shapers, indigenous knowledge holders, peace builders, culture makers, and frontline humanitarians about the lived experiences and visions that could translate into regenerative UN policies, organizational culture, and operations. This is for UN staff, partners, member states, and bridge builders who are curious about what regeneration means in practice and who are ready to turn the UN into a trailblazer for this shift. And today, I'm so happy to welcome Jon Alexander. Jon is a strategist, storyteller, and co-founder of the New Citizen Project, a creative consultancy on a mission to accelerate the shift from a consumer society to a citizen future. He helps leaders across sectors open up their organizations to real participation and shared purpose, grounded in the belief that all of us are smarter than any of us. Jon's award-winning book, Citizens: Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us, has become an underground classic, hailed by the Financial Times, McKinsey, and the World Economic Forum for reframing how institutions can unlock people's collective intelligence. Jon is also a visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. For UN in Search of Regeneration, Jon's vision offers a radical yet deeply human invitation to move from delivering to people toward working with people, from command and control to trust and co-creation. His citizenship could help transform the UN into a living, participatory ecosystem, one that listens at scale, acts with humility, and invites humanity back into multilateralism. So thank you very much, Jon, for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I feel like I don't need to do anything now. You've said it all. It's all done.
Well, we still need to get into the detail and we need to get all the solutions from you how to actually get the UN to this transformatory ecosystem for the planet. So I'm really happy that I can ask you all these questions today. And the first one that I actually ask all of my guests, what does regeneration mean to you in the context of systems change?
I think the core of it for me is the idea of falling back in love with humanity and with being human. I think what we've got ourselves into is a state where we're telling ourselves all the time that we're not good enough to face the challenges of our time and that we are the problem. And I think that really is that itself is the problem. Like, actually being human is a wonderful gift, and we are capable of amazing things. And if we do tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone, if we invite ourselves back into our kind of constructive and generative and rightful role in ecosystems, then we can do wonderful things very quickly. And I think that idea of humans as an integral part of ecosystems and creatures with a vital role to play, what I mean by regeneration.
That's beautiful, giving us back the sense of agency and the awareness that we can all be part of the solution and don't need to fall into this apathy and just accept the state of the world right now. So let's talk about subject to consumer to citizen. Can you explain this kind of evolution and why this citizen story is essential for our future?
Sure. And yeah, so my work, at the core of my work really is an offer of a way of seeing the moment in time we're living in through the lens of what I call stories of self and society. And as you say, subject, consumer, and citizen are the three labels that I give these stories. And it's easiest to introduce it as a kind of historical shift. So my argument is at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, the dominant story of self and society was what I call the subject story, as in subjects. And in that story, the right thing to do is to keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that there are a God-given few who are better than the rest, who know best, who will lead us to the best outcomes for society as a whole. This is the story of aristocracy and monarchy. It's the story of empires and colonies, and held as a logic for a long time in many ways. It was arguably deeply oppressive, but it fell apart at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, because industrial revolution, rise of the middle class, you simply couldn't sustain that logic anymore. And out of the two world wars, my argument is we then more or less deliberately, more or less consciously constructed what I call the consumer story. And in this story, the right thing to do is to pursue self-interest, because self-interest will add up to the collective interest. That is the best society will result. And we constructed a load of institutions and structures and systems out of this story, including, I would argue, the United Nations. And what we are living in right now, I think, is the collapse of that story, and as a result, a deep threat to the legitimacy of the institutions and systems that we constructed out of it. And so the reason why that story is collapsing right now is because you simply can't solve the challenges of our time from within the story that actually created them. So you can't solve crises of loneliness and mental ill health from within a story that says we're independent, isolated individuals. You can't solve crises of inequality from within a story that says that competition is the dynamic that will solve all problems, because actually what competition does is creates inequality. And you can't solve crises of ecology. You can't solve climate and nature crises from within a story that says that humans are separate from nature, and that happiness at the individual level and success at the societal level is best measured in terms of material standards of living, because the story created the crisis. And so what we're living in is through at this moment is the collapse of a story, not the collapse of humanity, and not the badness of humanity, but the badness of the story that we are trapped in and stuck in appealing to for our ideas of what the right thing to do is. And as that story collapses, as the consumer story collapses, the subject story is back, because in times of deep uncertainty, the appeal of a simplistic story that says, follow me and I will fix it, and actually think the systems aren't falling apart, those people are the problem, blame them. The appeal of that simplistic story is very strong because we are so uncertain. But what I'm arguing is that actually there is a whole other, much deeper, much truer story of humanity that is available to us to step into if we can see it and if we can reimagine our institutions from within it. And that's what I call the citizen story. And the citizen story says the right thing to do isn't just to keep your head down and do as you're told, nor is it to pursue self-interest. The right thing to do actually is to contribute your ideas and energy and resources to the pursuit of the best of society as a whole. And critically, for this conversation in particular, to reimagine and recreate our institutions as conduits of collective energy, collective intelligence, collective resource, because it's not that there are a God-given few who know best. That's not the case. Nor is it that self-interest will add up to collective interest. It doesn't. But that actually all of us are smarter than any of us. And that is the core truth that we have to tap into in this time. And if we can get everyone on the pitch, if we can reimagine our institutions in that way, then I believe that dramatic change, and I think we see it. Like the point of my work is that it's not a moral argument for what should be so much as an empirical argument of what is happening, if only we are able to see it. And just to close this out with one example that I love deeply, the Taiwanese COVID response is one that I always go to. And it's not told so much because of one of the flaws of our geopolitics. Taiwan isn't a member of the WHO, so this response was relatively invisible. But what they did was they crowdsourced their national response. They announced the design principles fast, fun, and fair at the outset. They said that they would tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. That's one of the places I got that phrase from. They set challenge prizes where the tech community would create apps that would track face mask availability and case outbreak and privacy and security. And they even set up a phone line where anyone could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better. And a little boy rang up and said, the boys in my class don't want to wear their face masks because they're pink and they think that they're girly. So you should do something to make pink face masks cool. And I think you should work with the baseball team. And 3 days later, they had half the Taiwanese baseball team, the president and the little boy on the national televised press conference in pink face masks. And
Wow.
this is a story that can sound crazy, can sound funny, can sound dangerous to institutions, but is actually a prime example of the kind of institutional renewal that I'm talking about, because it was the world's arguably the most successful response, second lowest death rate anywhere in the world, and the country as a whole never went into full lockdown. And that kind of thing is possible, even in the face of the most urgent challenge, if we open up our institutions, if we put our trust in people, and if we design processes that enable that to work.
I love your example. That's extremely inspiring. For that, I think we need to have this kind of leaders that are ready to open up to a collective intelligence and not just have their own preconceived ideas of how things have to happen. We as staff members, we do have agency in how we shape our individual programs and projects, and we also always have agency in how we show up ourselves at work. So do you have any advice for team leaders, for individual staff members? How can they create these conditions for more an approach that has more agency and more participation?
I think maybe to share one of the concepts that sits at the heart, another of the concepts sits at the heart of my work. I really love. Originally there was an article in Family Therapy by a man called Barry Mason. And he wrote this piece called Towards Positions of Safe Uncertainty. And what he said was so he draws a 2x2 matrix with safety at the top and uncertainty to the right. And he says anyone who comes for therapy, and for this I think we can read anyone who needs leadership or appeals to leadership, tends to see themselves in one of two positions. Either they're unsafe, uncertain, I don't know what to do. Mason characterizes it as a coordinates. Or they're unsafe, certain. I'm bad and I know I am. Self-hatred. And what they think they want, and what we tend to condition our leaders to believe that they need to provide, and our therapists, are solutions. Safe certainty. Tell me what to do to fix it. And Mason's argument is that safe certainty doesn't exist. He says solutions are only dilemmas that are less of a dilemma than the one we had before. And what he argues for is that actually the true role of a therapist, the true role of a leader, is to create what he calls safe uncertainty, which is this space where you're standing side by side with your team, with populations, with publics, with whoever you're working with, whoever you're leading, and saying, this is the question that we're facing, rather than this is the answer that I'm providing. And what might it look like for us to hold this question together? What answers can you find? And I think we can draw from the Taiwan story in that context as well. It is the spirit of saying, we need everyone involved. Like, we don't know how to get through this, but we do know that we'll get through it best if we tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. There is a role for leadership, but it's much more to pinpoint the question and the challenge than it is to provide the solution. And so that spirit of safe uncertainty I think is a really helpful one in all of these contexts, whether it's, as you say, whether it's kind of trying to, whether it's as a government of a country, or whether it's in a massive kind of multilateral process, or whether it's just in a team meeting. Principle of holding the question, trusting and investing your energy in creating the space and the process for people to find the answers to their own challenges, rather than trying to do it for them, runs up from the micro to the macro.
Absolutely. And then if you look at the external work the UN is doing across the world, places that have experienced a natural disaster and are in shambles and need to be rebuilt, or places that have experienced conflict and need to be rebuilt. In an ideal setting, what could be the role of the UN in these places? How could they encourage a more participatory approach where we ask the right questions and engage everybody, in your view?
I mean, I think the starting point in that kind of context, let's stay within the context of a natural disaster or whatever. And by the way, none of what I'm saying is intended in any way critically of anyone. Like I'm not a you're an insider. I don't know. I don't know. Some of the things I'm talking about probably are already happening. That's often what I find when I
Mm,
start to work with an organisation is that the best and the most citizen, what I would call the most citizen ways of working, are already present. It's just that they're not the
mm,
ones in the spotlight because we're still living in the frame of the consumer story that tells us that the
mm,
stories we should tell are stories about people being selfish and about heroic organizations fixing it for them and saving us from ourselves. But
mm,
to answer your question a bit more directly, I think well, like the second book people should read after a certain one called Citizens is one called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit. Solnit traces examples through history of where whenever disaster hits, actually the response is for citizens to come together and help one another and start to build solutions, as you've alluded to. And what she says is that the
mm,
great danger and the lesson of history is the great danger comes through what she calls elite panic, when actually this starts to scare us that people don't need the agencies to descend, and so we try and put solutions into place for them. And I think that the energy that is extremely powerful is to there's a lovely phrase, start with what's strong, not with what's wrong, and then use what's strong,
mm.
what's wrong. And it's the idea of coming in behind the energy of what citizens are and always do naturally do. So whether it's the mutual aid that is happening in the aftermath of the Los Angeles fires, or
Mm,
actually these mutual aid networks and systems pop up everywhere. And what it's about, I think, is approaches that seek to first celebrate and platform the agency that people are already demonstrating, and then feed it with resources and attention and energy, and say, what more can we do, and what more do you want? Uh, but start from the perspective that believes in people and seeks to support, rather than what we're invited into all the time, which is this story that people need to be saved and people need something to
mm,
rescue them, and therefore we will do that. I think that spirit of, and again, I keep referring to the Taiwan story, but I think it's quite helpful kind of to keep referring
mm,
to one thing as shorthand to build off. That was a story in the context of COVID, right? And when COVID hit, mutual aid groups, street WhatsApp groups sprung up all over the world. Uh,
mm,
Taiwan was arguably one of the only places where the government response, the institutional response, sought to celebrate and platform and then create channels for more of that participation, rather
mm,
than coming in and actually kind of cutting across that energy. There were others, actually. I mean, one of my favourite other examples from that same time to just demonstrate the range of these things.
mm,
Germany, there was in very early in COVID, in April 2020, I think it was, there was a mass hackathon. Uh, it was called Wir versus Virus, and you can find a very good write-up of this in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. But it was a
mm,
40,000 person hackathon, with people coming from civil society organizations, from businesses, and just from ordinary citizens, coming together to draw on all of that diverse expertise of business expertise, of academia, expertise of experience, people's
mm,
experience of people's lives, and contributing those to create solutions. And something like 130 different ideas that came out of that hackathon were implemented in Germany over the next 6 months. That
mm,
wasn't where the center of gravity of the German response or many others around the world ended up, but it's evidence that this kind of thing is possible and has happened in these situations.
Mm. Yeah, that's a beautiful example too. And I mean, in the UN system, actually working with civil society is one of the core elements of our strategies. And also listening to them, having consultations on the ground. We are often limited by resources, time constraints, and then also internal policies. But what do you think can help us to be more open to really getting in these citizen approaches that are happening? Do you have solutions for us?
I mean, what I always say working with large organizations and institutions is that
Mm.
the there's something to be said for acknowledging the context. And I know I keep throwing conceptual models into this conversation, but there's one more I want to share, which is
Please.
from an organization called the Bacana Institute. It's called the Two Loops
Yeah.
Theory of Change.
Mm.
And their argument is that in times of really fundamental change, there's a dominant system and a story out of which the institution, in this instance, a story out of which the institution is
Mm.
created and which all of its systems and structures are intended to uphold, and an emergent system, a kind of something that is happening in the gaps and in
Mm.
the cracks. And the work I do with large organizations and institutions, what we're generally doing is saying, let's accept that reality. Like, we know that the systems and structures and processes of this organization will have been designed out of a logic that is no longer fit for purpose. And we know that we have to work with that. Let's not beat ourselves up and hate ourselves because that's what we have to deal with. And there is space. There are spaces. There will already be small experiments, small ways of thinking and working that are going on. The work is then to spot those and accept that we have to live in two realities at once. We have to work within them as it's been created, and
Mm.
moral responsibility to start to foster the energy that's in the cracks and start to
Mm.
evolve with that. And the toolkit I would offer for that work is I sometimes talk about purpose and platform. And what I mean by those, purpose, platform, and prototype. So there's my 3 Ps for you. And what these are about is sort of 3 questions that you can ask yourself to start to build this kind of energy. So purpose is, what are we really trying to do in the world? Like, if we step back from what we're doing and the processes we're working in and so on, as a team, as a country mission, what are we really trying to do in the world? And frame that as a question. How can we, it might be at a country level, it might be, how can we work with the citizens of wherever to help that country flourish? Because if you articulate that question, then immediately you see that the things you have to do, the things that you're mandated to do day to day, are only one set of answers to that, and there is some oxygen around it for you to try different things. And then you say platform. The platform principle says, what are the structures and processes that you can create that make it meaningful and joyful for people to participate? How do you create and I put that together with the third principle, prototype, which is basically saying, accept the reality that you're not going to be able to transform this whole organization overnight, and instead try and spot the first places where a different way of working is emerging, or identify a first experiment that you can undertake that works from an alternative logic, and build the energy from there. And so it might be in a country mission. I don't know. I know I'm setting myself off on a thought experiment live on record, but it's okay. Well, we're working in we're working in Palestine. We're working in the West Bank right now. How do we foster? How do we help that community to thrive in this current context? And the starting point might be to say, well, okay, what are people already doing here that isn't seen on the global radar? Where are people coming together? And I know that that's happening. There are conversations, these sumud conversations, these solidarity conversations and efforts that are going on in spite of the hardest challenges, right? Like the most difficult content. How do you convene? And then it's like, might there be a space to convene and use the UN's sort of opportunity to create, to hold space, to bring some of those people together, some of the shelter, and just hold the conversation as to what might they want to do next, what resource might feed that energy and give them a little bit of space and support to continue their work and connect it up into something even more effective than what they're already doing. And so the world going into something like that, and I really want to be very careful here. Like, I'm not saying anyone is doing this wrong, and I'm not trying to make it sound like this is a very simple thing to do and whatever. Like, we are living in very difficult and dangerous times. And what I'm asking of people in many ways, people in big institutions, is to embrace an even more difficult life by trying to not just work with what they have to do and the systems they have to work within, but also to try and create and try and harness the energy and space to foster something emergent. And I think that's where we are and what we have to do. So I hope that gives some sort of...
Love that idea. Yes, thank you so much for this practical approach. There are already also processes in place we can build on, so it's not even far-fetched. And I think it's so fundamental to also creating programs that really work and where you don't create more dependencies. I heard others also talking about Jon as the citizen assembly guy. So I would really like to hear more about what this exactly is as a tool. How do they function successfully?
So, a citizens' assembly, and I always like to imagine that term with a capital C and a capital A, because it's not just citizen, whoever wants to turn up coming together. A citizens' assembly, technically defined, is a randomly selected but representative sample of a population at whatever level, local, national, global, brought together for a significant period of time with the opportunity to deliberate on an issue or a set of issues and hear from witnesses. So one of the lovely phrases in the literature on these kinds of processes is they talk about experts on tap, not experts on top. For the citizens themselves to propose recommendations as to what should be done on that issue for any stakeholders. So just to bring it to life, one of the most famous cases of this in Ireland between 2016 and 2018, there was a citizens' assembly that deliberated and put forward a recommendation for the legislative framework on abortion in Ireland. 99 randomly selected Irish citizens, representatives of the national population on all key demographics, brought together for 5 weekends over 5 months, which resulted in a proposal to legalise access to abortion in Ireland up to 12 weeks. That a lot of people know about the referendum in Ireland in 2018 that voted through that recommendation, with 66% of the population voting in favour of the amendment to the Constitution. Not many people know about is that arguably the reason why that successfully happened, despite all the usual misinformation, disinformation, was because of the assembly process that created the proposition. Because then when the country went to referendum, the people who were brought onto the radio shows and breakfast shows and so on were the randomly selected citizens who'd been part of the deliberations. And so to extend that argument and into sort of what, in my dream world, what would I imagine happening? I think these sorts of processes, one of the leading theorists in this kind of work, a man called James Fishkin, talks about democracy under good conditions. I think that's a lovely way of thinking about it, because the responsibility, I think, of organizations and institutions is not to do things for people, but to create the conditions, create good conditions for people to do things for themselves. One of the things I would imagine would be a process where actually structures like these might be used to renew and recontract with the global population things like the mandate of the UN, even perhaps the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you were to contract with humanity using some of these sorts of processes, a distributed set of citizens' assemblies around the world, an open kind of proposal phase and then this kind of structured deliberation, you could actually develop something that would have a meaningful global collective mandate that would actually give us a chance to renew our sense of ourselves and one another as citizens, rather than just trying to say, well, we wrote this, 13 people came together in a room 80 years ago and wrote this thing for us, so it must be right. I think that can feel quite threatening, I think, to the idea of opening something like that up. But my kind of core argument in this moment in time is we don't have a choice, really, to try and protect our institutions as they exist. Of trying to defend what we today have is itself the thing that is pushing people into the arms of those who would tear those institutions down. The institutions are born out of a logic that doesn't really hold anymore, and if we try to defend them, then we're actually expressing a lack of trust in people, and that's what makes them angry.
Thank you so much for this compassionate plea for a more participatory approach to also defining our global values as people. And maybe they're also not really what we want them to be, right? It could also be that a lot of cultures have a very different idea of what a citizen is, what democracy is, what human rights are. And it's not fair if one part of the planet decides it. And maybe it needs to be more contextualized also. But we're running out of time, unfortunately, and I have many more questions for you, but I have to ask you one that I ask everybody. If you were the Secretary General who would start the new office on the 1st of January 2027, what would you do inside the organization? What kind of policies would you implement to create the platform, the framework for all of the change that you want to see happening?
I mean, to be honest, my thought experiment that I've just shared would be my big idea. I would say
Amazing.
we need to crowdsource a renewal of this basic contract with humanity, and I do think it's possible. Maybe where I'll go with this is just to say I think in this time the opportunity is more. Let me share one more thing with you. So there's a set of scenarios for the future that I think is very powerful. They talk about, it's called the long crisis scenarios. And what they do with this is they argue that the two kind of key axes against which we can understand the possible futures in this time are the two key questions are will we be able to identify some kind of coherent set of values, not the same, but some degree of coherence, or will we essentially be polarized? Are we essentially polarized? And then the other distinction is, will power be centralized or will it be distributed? And I think we tend to, because of the era that we're coming to the end of, the default is to assume that power will be centralized and then to see polarization rising. And in this work, they talk about the centralized and polarized future they call the rise of the oligarchs. And I think we're transfixed by the threat of that reality. It feels like where we are. And what they call the centralized coherent scenario, they call it Big Mother in this work. And I think we're spending a lot of time trying to create Big Mother, like something that will protect us from ourselves. And I think I would argue too much of our energy and time is going into that work, which is ultimately futile. As you said, as you allude to, we can't really kind of create a single model that can protect humanity from itself. And I think the right hand side of the diagram, where we embrace the idea of a distributed power future, becomes much more interesting. And I tend to call that the idea that we might be working towards, the future we might be able to build, is one where I think there is a degree of coherence of values that's plausible and possible. I've traveled all over the world. I've worked with these sorts of processes in many different places and told stories of people who have done the same. And so a set of coherent values but distributed power becomes really interesting. And I think we might call that future something like messy beautiful. And we might imagine it a UN in that world, or less as a kind of single universalized block, big mother United Nations, and more as a kind of that sort of sits on top and tries to make everything add up. That feels like a fool's errand. And more imagine the United Nations kind of coming underneath and being more of a pollinator and a connector, an interstory between those who are trying to build that beautiful future. Something that a distributed institution that connects the messiness up and pollinates across it rather than a single kind of monolithic entity. And that's the culture
A tissue that connects the interstitium, I think it's called in the human biology, that could enable this system to increase, enhance, strengthen relationships, but doesn't over impose or power over. Yeah, that's a beautiful view. Thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom. This was so enlightening and inspiring to create this kind of new future where citizens have a real voice and agency. So thank you. And we'll share the links in the show notes, how people can reach out to you and work with you.
Find me, ask me stuff, heckle me. I love to learn about these ideas by testing them out with people. So it's been a joy to be in conversation with you, and I look forward to more.
Thank you, Jon.